Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Conservative Party. It's an honor for Lydia and I to be here today. On Saturday afternoon, 2:39 Eastern, an F-22 flying from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia shot down the Chinese spy balloon 6 nautical miles off the coast of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. That balloon first entered sovereign U.S. airspace in the Aleutians. It then flew over the Alaskan landmass, down through western Canada, entered the lower 48 states in Idaho. From there, it surveilled Malmstrom, Offutt, F.E. Warren, Minot, and Whiteman Air Force bases, where we base critical elements of our strategic deterrence. And this incursion, this provocative incursion, reminds us once again that we are under unrelenting assault from the People's Republic of China. So, we have an enemy. It's not a competitor, it's not an adversary, it is an enemy. And the question is this Chinese enemy already waging war on us? Thank you. The answer is yes. The answer is hell yes, because Communist China, in fact, declared a quote-unquote people's war on America, a phrase that has special meaning to the Communist Party. And it has, despite official denials, a doctrine of unrestricted warfare. Now, unfortunately, warfare is inherent in the Communist Party's political system, which idealizes both struggle and domination. And so we should be asking, what does Communist China really want? Answer is simple. It wants to take away our sovereignty and rule the world. And it also wants to rule the near parts of the solar system. And yes, I know that sounds ludicrous, but no, I'm not exaggerating. On planet Earth, Chinese ruler Xi Jinping is trying to impose the imperial era notion that Chinese rulers not only had the mandate of heaven to rule Tianxia, which means all under heaven, but that actually heaven compelled them to do so. And indeed, with regard to the solar system, the Chinese, since about 2017, their space officials have been talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. In other words, part of the People's Republic of China. And that means they consider these near heavenly bodies to be like the South China Sea, theirs and theirs alone. And it also means that they will try to exclude us from going to the moon and Mars if they have the capability to do so. And we do not need to speculate about that because Chinese officials constantly talk about that. So now that we know about what they want, the question is, what are their unrestricted warfare tactics to get it? And today we'll talk about 2 of them: subversion and disinformation operations, and fentanyl. With regard to subversion, China tries to use every point of contact to undermine our society, to take it down. And what we are seeing are these very large Chinese troll and bot operations. Now, these are much larger than Russia's from all accounts. So, for instance, Twitter in June 2019 took down 174,000 fake Chinese accounts. That's one social media platform, 1 month, 174,000 accounts. Now, with these big networks, China is trying to determine outcomes in our political system. They favored Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. They favored Biden over Trump in the general election. And now they're pushing things like critical race theory. How do they do this? Well, engineers at Douyin, which is TikTok's sister site in China, control the algorithms for TikTok, especially the algorithms that curate content. In other words, to determine what your children see and what they don't see. And this gives Beijing the ability to, as they say, boost the signal. In other words, to amplify their propaganda. Now, how does this work out in practice? Well, in July of 2021, Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State, closed China's consulate in Houston. And the question is, well, why did they close Houston instead of one of the other 4 Chinese consulates? Well, State explained, oh, the Chinese, they are conducting espionage operations in Texas. Well, that's also true of the other 4 consulates. I think that State closed Houston because China was giving logistical and financial support to violent protesters, and their operation was based in the Houston consulate. Radio Free Asia reports that in that year, 2021, intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army actually based themselves in the consulate, and from there they used big data and artificial intelligence to identify Americans likely to participate in Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests. And then they sent those Americans videos on how to riot via TikTok. We also know that they have, through TikTok, glorified drug use, which is one of Beijing's projects to weaken America. And that brings us to our second Chinese tactic, which is fentanyl. Fentanyl is coming across our southern border in record quantities. The drug is designed and manufactured in China. The components are then sent to the Mexican cartels, who then smuggle it into the United States. These days, the most recent variation of fentanyl is mixed with dye, which means they're trying to make it appear like candy, which means that they are marketing death to our children. It's called rainbow fentanyl. And fentanyl has also been mixed with prescription drugs, which means that Americans have already died because they thought they were taking their medication. Now, the Communist Party in China runs a total surveillance state. These large fentanyl gangs could not operate unless the party knew about it. But even more important, the fentanyl gangs are laundering their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. And we know that Beijing's diplomatic support for the fentanyl gangs. So what we have to say is that of the 80,000 or so deaths last year from fentanyl, and fentanyl mixed with cocaine and methamphetamines, we should consider each of those deaths a murder. Now, President Biden does not understand the viciousness of the Communist Party. He's still trying to negotiate deals with them. But China is in no mood to talk in good faith with the United States. We know that it doesn't honor any of its obligations. And we have seen this with regard to intellectual property, with trade, with South China Sea, with Hong Kong, with everything. So there's no point in talking to Beijing at this moment. And at this moment, we have a political and military establishment that does not understand the urgency of the situation. In the Oval Office, in the Pentagon, and in the halls of Congress, there is very little sense that time is of the essence. But as we hear today, we know that Xi Jinping is preparing for war. At the Communist Party's 20th National Congress in October, he appointed what is now called the War Cabinet. We know, of course, that China is involved in the fastest military buildup since the Second World War. Xi Jinping is trying to sanction-proof his regime, and most ominously, he is preparing China's civilians for war. And it's not hard to see why Xi Jinping thinks he needs to go into battle. I believe that he now perceives that there is a closing window of opportunity for him to achieve what he believes to be our historic goals, because his China is beset by simultaneous crises. There's continuing debt defaults, plunging property prices, a contracting economy, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and fast-moving COVID-19 outbreaks, which by the end of this winter will have infected probably 1 or 1.1 billion Chinese, and will take the lives of between 1 and 2 million of them. Moreover, if this weren't bad enough, China is at the edge of the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. China, between now and the turn of the century, will lose something between 900 million and 1 billion people. By the turn of the century, it will be perhaps a third as populous as it is today. And to put this into context, At this moment, China is more than 4 times more populous than the United States. Turn of the century, we'll be about the same size. China will be lucky if it has 30 to 40 million more people than we do. So, what does this mean? Well, we know that Xi Jinping, in this closing window of opportunity, has one grand goal, and that is to annex the Taiwan. Now, Chinese communist leaders for decades have been saying, well, Taiwan, formerly the Republic of China, must be absorbed into the People's Republic of China. So the question is, well, what's new? What's new is that in the past, leaders were just going through the motions. They didn't really care that much about it. Xi Jinping does. Xi Jinping believes that this problem, as he calls it, cannot be passed down from one generation to the next. He believes that Taiwan must be annexed within his period of rule, which he calls the quote-unquote new era. So unfortunately, he has made the destruction of the island's democracy a test of his personal legitimacy, which means that we must stop him. Now, the United States for decades, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives as president, has had a doctrine of strategic ambiguity. In other words, we don't tell the Chinese, we don't tell the people in Taiwan what we're going to do in the case of an imminent conflict. And as we know, that policy has worked. But that policy has worked in a benign era, and we are no longer in a benign era. Now, Chinese leaders say that we do not deter them. So we need to take them at their word. And obviously we don't deter them because they flew that balloon over our country. So I believe that we need a president of the United States who will clearly and publicly announce that the United States will defend Taiwan. We need to offer Taiwan a mutual defense treaty if it wants it. We need to recognize Taiwan as Taiwan if they want it. I believe that we need to move supplies like ammunition to the island on an emergency basis. And I also believe that we should be basing American troops there as a tripwire. Now, many people will say that's risky. Yeah, it's risky. But saying something is risky is no longer a meaningful objection because after 3 decades of misguided China and Taiwan policy, every course of action is risky. Everything is risky and dangerous. But the most risky and dangerous option of all is to continue with the policies that got us into this disastrous situation in the first place. Why defend Taiwan? Well, first of all, since the late 1800s, the late 1800s, the United States has drawn its western defense perimeter off the coast of East Asia. And Taiwan sits at the center of that critical perimeter. It's where the East China Sea and South China Sea meets. Taiwan prevents the Chinese Navy and Air Force from surging into the Western Pacific, where we certainly don't want them. But there's a more important reason. People talk about chips. Taiwan makes 92% of the world's made-to-order chips, in other words, the most sophisticated ones. There's a more important reason. China every day attacks not just our democracy, but all democracies, the concept of democracies, and we cannot allow China to annex any democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. And there's one more thing. After the fall of Afghanistan, we disheartened and we angered our allies. It's a catastrophic event in our history. Now, Taiwan is seen as the critical test of American capability and resolve. And we could not afford to fail again. But as I mentioned, we have a defense establishment that doesn't really understand that this is a matter of not the 2030s or the 2040s, but today. Our military is actually wanting to take out our cruisers and our F-22s in order to pay for modernization, to pay for the force of the 2040s. In other words, we have a Pentagon that wants us to make us less capable to oppose a China of today. And if there's going to be a war with China, it's not going to be in the 2030s or the 2040s. It's probably going to be soon. As General Mike Minahan, who is the chief of the Air Mobility Command, said in a memo, his gut says that we'll be fighting in 2025. And if we don't change the drift of course of events, it could very well be before that. So what should we do? I have an action plan, 7 items plus 3 more. First of all, we need to sever trade with China. This means getting our pharmaceutical businesses off of Chinese soil. We should not be enriching a hostile regime. We should not be making them more capable to kill Americans. We must cut off the blood supply to those who mean us harm. Second thing, we should prohibit investment into Chinese companies. President Trump banned investment into Chinese military-linked companies, but we should go further. And the reason we should go further is because all Chinese companies, civilian, military, however they call themselves, they are all in one, and they all support the Chinese war effort. Remember, China is a totalitarian society. Nobody can disobey an order of the Communist Party. We should not be enriching a hostile Chinese regime with our investment dollars. Third, we should be getting rid of the Chinese agents in our country. That means we should be closing down the remaining 4 consulates. We should be stripping down the embassy from a cast of hundreds down to just the ambassador. We need to get rid of the Chinese state banks in our country because they're the ones who are laundering the fentanyl profits. We need to end the Confucius Institutes, all of them, and more important, the Confucius classrooms in our secondary school. This is our country. We do not have to put up with this. Fourth thing, we should end all technical cooperation with China. Remember, it was Americans who taught Chinese researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology how to manipulate coronaviruses to make them more dangerous to humanity. That was somebody called Dr. Fauci. Fifth thing, we should not allow China to buy our tech companies. Sixth, we should not allow Chinese parties to own ranch and farmland in the United States. We know in places like Oklahoma that the Chinese have been involved in illegal marijuana grows. They have been basing child sex trafficking operations in Chinese land, and China wants to use some of its land for espionage purposes. In Oklahoma, the Chinese build fences on their property. Big deal. Everybody in Oklahoma has a fence. But everybody in Oklahoma has a fence. They use it to keep people out. The Chinese are building fences on their property to keep people in. Until we find out what the hell is going on, they shouldn't be on our land. Seventh thing, well, now that we shot down the balloon, we should not let the Biden administration do what it wants to, which is just to forget what's occurred. 3 more things. First of all, tell your broker to sell mutual funds that include Chinese stocks. The international mutual funds, many of them do that. Matter of fact, the federal government runs something called the Thrift Savings Plan. It's the 401k for federal employees. Since 2001, members of our uniformed services have been allowed to invest in TSP, and that means our uniformed service members are funding Chinese weapons companies that are building the instruments that are designed to kill Americans. Second thing, don't buy Chinese goods if you have an option. Third thing, let's support Senator Rick Scott. He is pushing cool legislation. That's cool as in country of origin labeling. That means websites have to tell us where all of this crap comes from. This is a great idea. Let's get behind it. Now, all of these steps will take political will, which means creating bottom-up pressure, which means educating, means grassroots organizing, means electing candidates who will oppose China. And of course, none of this is easy. But what will our children and grandchildren think when they realize that we had the means to stop China, but chose not to do so? Each of us has the ability to act. And we have to act, particularly now, because China's not going to give us a second chance. This is a moment of peril because our leaders are not defending us. And so, yes, we must mobilize for 2024. But in the meantime, we have to make sure that Biden and Communist China's other allies in Washington and New York don't sell us out. But we can do this. After all, we are Americans. We stand our ground, we do not yield, and we are the last line of defense. Thank you.
Go ahead, I'll grab a mic and we'll give you some questions. All right, the questions have been flying in. Let's start with this one, all right? China has permeated every major institution in America, including and especially Congress. Given that reality, how does the average American citizen effectively fight back? You've addressed some of that. Severely limit, if not ban, Chinese exchange students. Any thought on that?
Yeah. About 13% of the students from China, the Chinese nationals, are estimated to commit espionage in our universities. One of the things is that China's trying to commit espionage, but the question is, why do they think they can get away with this? They think they can get away with this because for decades, we have allowed Ministry of State Security agents and our Chinese diplomats to surveil students on our campuses. We've allowed them to violate our sovereignty. So the first step is we got to start turfing out these Ministry of State Security guys, and we need to start expelling diplomats. We know what's going on, we see them, and we don't do anything about it. We had this Chinese police station in New York, which has now been closed, thank God, at least according to the reports. And the question is, why would the Chinese think that they could get away with it? Well, for the same reason. We've allowed them to violate our sovereignty, so they said, no big deal. We'll fly a balloon over the Midwest of the United States. We'll open up police stations across the country. This, as I mentioned, is our country. Now, my dad was a Chinese student, so I have a particular personal stake in this in a sense. But the point is, there are a lot of things that we can do to make sure that Chinese students don't commit espionage. And we have to obviously start doing that. But this is a whole of society effort on our part, because it's not just the Chinese students, it's Wall Street, Walmart, all the rest of it. All of our society, as the questioner mentions, has been penetrated.
And that leads into the next question. Is the U.S.'s unwillingness to fight back in this war due wholly to China's compromise of corporate America, even using Chinese slave labor? And what is the best or fastest way for American patriots to reorient our CEOs for our benefit?
The reason why CEOs have become woke recently is because the left, not the right, but the left has organized shareholders. And it's a very simple thing to do. And we haven't done it. So first thing is we actually start to go to shareholders meetings, start screaming and yelling, start using our votes. Part of this is, yes, we have allowed China to develop, to allow Wall Street, Walmart, as I said, all of these institutions to have these links with China. And those links create financial incentives for them to support China. And so you have those terrible incidents involving the NBA and Nike. Nike, by the way, and this is something that we need to do, lectures us about social diversity and social justice and all the rest of it. And in China, it maintained a 3 decades relationship with a South Korean contractor that did nothing but make Nike shoes. This was in Qingdao in Shandong province. And there, the workers were essentially in a concentration camp-like facility, and the workers were Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities. So Nike was using essentially slave labor to produce the shoes while it could make money so it could lecture us Americans. And we just need to start pointing this out because they have been able to use media, and we can do the same thing, especially because we got social media platforms which, although have been controlled by the left, nonetheless are starting to open up. And indeed, it does give us a voice. So we need to exercise that voice. This is going to be hard. This is convincing your neighbor, convincing the person down the street. This is a person-by-person operation. And there's 330 million of us, so this is going to take maybe a little bit of time. But the one good news in all of this is that China is acting so belligerently that it is changing the conversation, and we need to take advantage of that. It's not just COVID-19, it's not just balloons, it's not just everything else. It's everything at the same time. Beijing is incredibly arrogant and believes it can do whatever it wants, and we need to disabuse them. And we can actually start working because Beijing has been so difficult. So this is something that we can do.
You once entitled the book, The Coming Collapse of China. Is that collapse still on the horizon? And I'll just add one thought to that. Can you speak to the declining demographic birth population that China is dealing with?
Yeah, in 2001, I wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China, which I predicted that the Communist Party would fall in a decade. So I'm perhaps the last person to talk about problems inside China, but the point is, I didn't foresee the 2008 downturn and some other things. But the point is that right now, China is obviously exhibiting signs of fragility. And I just ran through a quick list of them. But China's most fundamental problem is that it's going to go from a nation of 1.41 billion down to 450 million or so in the space of 8 decades. And that is going to be something that we've never seen before in society. And it's not just a question of numbers. China has a skewed sex ratio for various reasons. There are various estimates between 30 to 35 million more men than females. The total fertility rate is dropping so fast because of a number of things, including pessimism. So China has got all of these problems, which makes it even more dangerous than it normally would be. Because just think about from a common sense point of view. Now, if you're Chinese and you're a Chinese leader, you would normally think that China's going to rule the world. That's what they want. That's where they see things going. And if you really believe that, then you would be very nice to the United States and Europe and everybody else, because you would just realize that things over there would gently decline and China would grow stronger, and that the forces of history, and remember, these are communists, so they believe in history. The forces of history means that you will end up dominating the world. But what is China doing right now? It is provoking crises. It's getting Americans upset. It is mobilizing the American citizenry to oppose China. And that means the Chinese themselves see problems inside their own regime. The Communist Party, I think, is insecure. And one other thing, the question didn't ask this, but we should just cover it in a moment, and that is that the Communist Party sees the United States as an existential threat. And they see us as an existential threat, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. An insecure political system is worried about the inspirational impact of our values and our form of governance over the Chinese people. China has the biggest surveillance state, uses the most coercive outside of North Korea. They do this because they're worried about what the Chinese people will do. And we saw that in those extraordinary protests that started on November 24th inside China. This is a regime that is deathly afraid of its own future, which means this is a regime that's going to lash out. This is a United States that's not prepared for that.
In Sodus, New York, the Chinese bought an apple farm a few years ago, supposedly to test their pesticides on apples. They have only used it for photo opportunities. Can New York State stop this if the Biden administration will not?
New York State can do that. Your governor does have emergency powers. And one of the things that is of great concern is, well, why are they buying farmland? Well, one could say, well, they were worried about their declining self-sufficiency in food, and yes, they are. But I think that one of the reasons why they're actually buying farmland, because it's not really practical in the sense, if you think about it, that in an emergency, that we will allow Chinese farm products to be exported through our ports across the Pacific to China. I worry that they are buying farmland because they want to poison American agriculture. And we see this, for instance, if you go back about 15 months ago, there was that incident where China was sending seeds into the US unsolicited. Well, that's invasive species, and that can cause problems in our agriculture, plus also other problems in society. I worry about this, and if I were Kathy Hochul, which I'm probably not, I would worry about this, and I would say I'm using whatever emergency powers I have to expropriate that apple farm and get the Chinese off that land and make sure they don't bring in poisonous insecticides into the state of New York, because you have agriculture.
Excellent, excellent. Could you touch on
Unrestricted warfare.
Could you touch on digital currency and government control that is being inserted into the United States of America?
China has a digital renminbi. I worry a lot about China. I do not worry about the digital renminbi. And the reason is, digital renminbi was created so that the Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, could exert more control over people's spending. Because with the digital currency, you can basically expropriate all the money out of a person's account just with the click of a switch. China already has the world's most sophisticated electronic payment platforms, especially two of them. One run by Ant Group called Alipay. The other is WeChat Pay, run by Tencent, another large Chinese internet company. These are far beyond what we have in our country. What Beijing is doing with the digital renminbi is to try to undercut the commercial viability of Tencent's and Ant Group's electronic payment platforms. So this is civil war inside the Chinese financial system, which means that if they want to undercut themselves, I'm all for it. Now, digital currencies in general, this is something that the United States has not moved toward. It is obviously very controversial for the same reasons that it would be controversial in China. We'd be competing with our own companies, but also we'd be giving the Federal Reserve and any administration at the time unprecedented power over the money of the American people. We just need to resist it. That's not a China issue, that's a personal liberty issue, and that's a conservative issue, because conservatism is the political philosophy that sovereignty resides in the individual. That means all of you guys, which means all of you guys can mobilize yourselves to make sure that we do not have a digital currency in the United States.
Time is growing short, but do you have any final remarks for us?
My wife said I had to end on an optimistic note. And after 29 years of marriage, I know that there is no point in arguing. So here's my optimistic story, which is about war in another time, but it's all wrapped up with a happy ending. And Russ, you'll appreciate this story for a moment, and you'll see why. My dad came to this country on a Chinese government scholarship from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. He left China on a plane that flew over the Himalayas, landed in India, boarded a Liberty ship, which went all the way down to Australia to avoid Japanese submarines, and then up to San Pedro, port of Los Angeles, where he landed in February 1945. He took the train to San Francisco, and then, Russ, he had a problem. He asked for which train to go to Buffalo. Nobody understood him. Eventually, he learned that Russ and others, as you know, that the correct pronunciation of that city is Buffalo. So my dad gets on the Transcontinental Railway, makes his way through Buffalo, ends up in Ithaca, New York, where he gets his master's degree in civil engineering in 1946 from a New York State institution called Cornell. So, right afterwards, Mao Zedong's communists take over China, but a generous America allows him to stay. So what did my dad do with his engineering degree? Well, he did what everybody with an engineering degree would do. He opened up a 4-table restaurant in his garage in Keansburg, New Jersey, serving Chinese food. It completely failed. So my dad's plan B was to take his engineering degree and use it for engineering. He got a job with a public utility in New Jersey. On the day he turned 55, the first day he was eligible for early retirement, he got out of there and he started a Chinese takeout in Madison, New Jersey, where he lived. That takeout became a restaurant. He took the money from the restaurant, he bought a building, renovated it, sparked the rejuvenation of the town center. My dad never missed an opportunity to vote. He never missed an opportunity to tell my 3 sisters and me, who, by the way, all went to Cornell, he never missed an opportunity to tell the 4 of us how great his adopted country was. He would always say that China was his birthplace, but America was his home. So here's the optimistic story. I learned from my dad that not only is America a great country, but that also we are a good people. So thank you all for defending the country that my dad loved so much.